So just a reminder, because it's been a couple of weeks since we've been here, I have started doing a sermon series through our new Memphis First United Methodist values. And those values are that the Christ in me receives the Christ in you, the Christ in me responds to the Christ in you, and the Christ in us transforms the world. And so 2 weeks ago, I did the Christ. And so I talked about this God who is outside of us and other than us. And then last week we were with the Presbyterians. And so there was a break to this sermon series. However, last week, if you were here, I just want to remind you that one of the reasons I said that I find Jesus to be such an enigma is precisely because of his storytelling. That despite the church spending 2,000 years trying to sort of soften or neuter his parables by making them into simple, clear moral lessons, Jesus told stories that forced people into deep moral struggle, and then often he didn't alleviate that struggle. Including in our scripture where he's like, yeah, I tell parables so that they can hear it and they won't even understand. And it's like, what? That is not how seminary trained me to preach. They were like, you need to exposit the text. You need to talk about God. People are struggling. They need to have answers, man. They need to have good, clear moral rules. And then here's Jesus saying, yeah, I tell these stories so they don't know what's going on. Jesus told stories that forced people into moral struggles. Stories that forced us to see the world from a perspective that is outside our categories of thinking. This is why, for example, good people in his parables, good people like Pharisees and Sadducees who were good people, this is why they rarely serve as the heroes of the story. It baffles me that the church has become a community where good moral people who follow the rules are somehow exemplary examples of Christian morality, and Jesus almost never uses the merely good moral people as exemplary of the kingdom. Good people like the Pharisees and Sadducees rarely serve as the heroes of the story. Instead, the heroes tend to be morally suspect people. It's not the brother who stayed home and followed all the rules, but the brother who went and squandered everything and came back and learned how to make things right with his family and his father. It's the politically compromised person who's the hero, like the tax collector. Jesus' heroes are racially other Samaritans, or they're corrupt business people like the shrewd manager. Somehow Jesus has taken our moral categories, flipping them on this head in order to do something, confuse us, so that we genuinely walk away saying, I don't even know. And so modern preachers like myself are trained to end the sermon by saying, here is a clear moral rule, an application that you can follow. But Jesus wanted us to walk away thinking that story didn't feel moral at all. I have been thinking about this, and I began my sermon this way because I want to try something similar today. And it carries some risk, both theologically and rhetorically. And so what I want to do is I want to take a story that we are familiar with, and I want to turn that story upside down to illustrate the phrase, Christ in me, from our value statement. Now, we are all familiar with the Trojan horse story. In the story, in the Trojan War, the Greeks leave a massive wooden horse outside the walls of Troy as a supposed peace offering. Some some inside the city of Troy are skeptical of it. So I read the Odyssey and the Iliad a few years ago, and some inside the city are skeptical of it. One person even says this. He says they're trying to figure out what the deal with this horse is. It's not a normal gift. And one guy says, whatever it is, I fear the Greeks even when they bear gifts. Another character throws a spear at the gut of the horse, hoping to penetrate deeply enough inside to see if there's anything sinister inside. But the spear doesn't go deep enough to expose anything. And so they conclude that the gift must be safe. In fact, they're so excited about the gift that they tear down a section of their own wall in order to bring the behemoth into the city. And that night, when everyone is asleep, the Greek soldiers climb out of the horse, overthrow the city from within without a battle and without resistance. This story has endured for thousands of years because of its unsettling tension. The horse is both a gift and a threat. Its true nature, though, cannot be evaluated from a distance. Troy has to bring it into a place of vulnerability to discover what it truly is. But once inside the city's defenses, when the defenses no longer exist, everything changes. The story is one of deception and not salvation. It is one of death, not rebirth. And it is proof that trusting your enemies will destroy you. But I would like to play with this imagery. I would like to suggest that from a different angle that the Christian story actually offers us a warning that is similar. Not about enemies outside our gates, but about the Christ who is in us. The gospel warns us against trusting Christ. The gospel warns us against trusting Christ. The gospel might as well say, whatever it is, I fear God even when God bears gifts. Do you remember when Jesus said this very thing? Before you come and be my disciple, count the cost. Count the cost. Everything around you in your world says that if you just go with the flow, if you just participate in the system, if you don't question it, you can have a good, nice, safe life. But if you're going to come and follow me, count the cost, because it's going to cost you more than money, it's going to cost you more than things, it's going to cost you your reputation, and it may even cost you your life. Jesus warns us about this. Jesus, we might say, intends to destroy us from the inside. Not by violence and by force, but destroy us by gift. A gift that cannot be held at a distance. It must be brought inside to be known at all. A gift that when we least expect it overthrows the false rulers of our lives so that we can become what Paul calls a brand new city, a brand new creation. There is an old fortress of walled sin, of walled trauma, of walled falseness within each of us. And our society is trying its hardest to protect that so that you don't see it and begin to tear it down. But Christ approaches that fortress as both a gift and a threat, a Trojan horse of liberation. This is why Paul says, my old self has been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. So I live in this earthly body by trusting in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. There's Trojan horse themes all over the place in Paul's language. There is an overthrow of leadership. A new regime is coming to power. Loyalties are rearranged. And this is not simply for personal individual self-improvement. It is an overthrowing of all in me that is false. It is not merely good enough for us to reform. We must abolish the old self. In Paul's words, it must be crucified with Christ. So that the gift and the threat are one and the same. I think about C.S. Lewis's language in the original The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where Lucy says, is he safe, is he good? And I think it's Tumnus who says, he's not safe, but he is good. Christ is both gift and threat. And they're not different things. It is not the gift of heaven and the threat of hell that we're talking about. It is not the gift of eternal salvation and the threat of eternal damnation. It is the gift of Christ in me and the beautiful threat of Christ in me. He gifts us and threatens us by overthrowing our need to control the outcomes of our lives. He gifts us and threatens us by dismantling our need to please others. He gifts us and threatens us by disrupting our need to stay busy so that we can avoid silence and sitting with our feelings. He gifts us and threatens us by abolishing our religion of surface-level moralism and replacing it with a deep, honest new creation. He gifts us and threatens us by questioning our loyalties to nation or family or persons, by calling us to worship someone who was crucified by the state and dismantled the centrality of the family. He gifts us and threatens us by inviting us to risk our lives for something that matters rather than spending our lives at ease and comfort. He gifts us and threatens us by giving us the ability to see our true God-given selves for the first time. And maybe that's the scariest part of the whole thing. Because we can't prepare for the next part of our value statement where we talk about me, the Christ in me, receiving the Christ in you, until we are willing to face the gift and the threat of Christ in me and how that dismantles who I think I am. You see, I think, if I can just be honest and have a moment of confession, I think one of the weaknesses of you all listening to me preach every week for years on end is that I have a particular accent toward talking about holy love for neighbor, right? That this is why we exist. We exist to help meet needs. We exist to serve other people. We exist to learn how to love our enemies. We exist to receiving the other person. Next week's sermon is going to be very natural for me. But the weakness of that is that we begin to shape this Christianity that is so entirely centered on neighbor that we don't do the necessary self-reflective spiritual work to ask, what am I bringing to my neighbor? Who am I before I encounter my neighbor? What is my neighbor even experiencing when they experience me? Are they experiencing someone who is confident in God or is constantly trying to acquire and consume more in order to give himself an identity? I mean, I'm just going to tell you right now, this is, Martha, Don can probably affirm this. This is, I think, one of the deep threats of people who do what I do for a living is that we are so good at telling other people how to arrange their lives and so good at denying and deflecting what's happening in our lives. You could pay me to do this, and I could fake it so well that most people wouldn't be able to tell. It is scary to be the kind of community where we don't just serve other people, but we have to be aware of who we are even before we reach out in service or in welcome or in reception to other people. I would like to claim, in fact, that even though it is good and right, I think, for me to constantly call us to love for neighbor, especially a holy love for our most vulnerable neighbors, I would like to argue that you cannot, in fact, truly see Christ in others or receive Christ in others until you are willing to see Christ in yourself as both threat and gift. Right in the messiness of your life. One of the writers I've been reading the last few years, a guy named Trevor Hudson, he is South African writer. One of his phrases is, God's home address is reality. If you're trying to pretend that your life is not as messy as it is, you're not going to be able to show up as your full self with God, with your family, with your neighbor. As long as we're pretending and we're putting on the face, we can't see the face that God made. So right in your messy life, that's God's home address. Right in your aging body, that is God's home address. Right in your body that has sickness, that is God's home address. Right in your argument with your children on the way into church, that is God's home address. Right in your resentment toward your spouse, that is God's home address. Right in your anxiety and your exhaustion and your search for who you are and your fear about your job and your fear about your money and your fear about your debt and your fear about all these things, this is God's home address. God is not going to meet us anywhere where we are not authentic and real. But God is also interested not just in individuals who are authentic and real, but the formation of entire communities that are authentic and real, which means that in order for us to receive Christ in others, we have to be working together to understand what it takes to be a safe community for the people that God brings to us so that we can receive them open-handedly without judgment, without initial responses of disgust or frustration. You are, in other words, the city of Troy. You are gifted Christ, not out of deception, but out of divine love, and yet this gift will unmake you. And it will unmake your church if we allow it to do its job. It will reorient you. It will overthrow false rulers that we have all built to survive. But the self that emerges will not be a loss. It will be the first real vision and version of you that has ever existed. The one that actually reflects Christ in you, the self God intended before any of the defensive walls were built. When you lose your life, Christ said, then you find it. So at this table, communion embodies everything that I'm talking about. It is why we receive communion every single week as a reminder that it is God's gift to us, given for our reconciliation, given for our peace, but it cannot be admired at a distance. It has to be taken in and received into the body. It is the gift of nourishment and life, but communion is no mere spiritual nostalgia. It is also a threat. It is an invitation to consent to God's love doing the real difficult work of chipping away those false parts of me that have been calcified all over my heart. God doing that not through violence, but through the love that is dismantling our defenses. To receive communion is to say yes to a gift that I don't get to control. It is to say yes to a gift that says I will trust whatever Christ unravels will not end in my destruction, but in my life. To trust that Christ in me is truly God's gift to the world.